This is Lecture 54A in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, which will be Volume 3, Communism in East Asia. That'll be Chapter 55 in your book when you get it next year, on Northeast Asia and Northwest America. And what that encompasses is Siberia, Mongolia, a fringe part of northern China, and Beringia, that is the land area that extended 5 times between Asia and Northwest America, Alaska, the Yukon, and northern British Columbia. So that's why we call it Northeast Asia and Northwest America. In the last lecture we were finishing on Japan, which would usually be in a Northeast Asian lecture. I mentioned that we're going to Siberia, and Siberia in fact will be the first of these areas that's on the Northeast Asian continent. It borders in the west on the Ural Mountains. From these mountains, you can go west toward the Siberian lowlands, and we can move to the east all the way to the Yenisei River. Now from that river, further east come the central Siberian Highlands, which are bordered on the east by the basin of the Lena River. And continuing east, we arrive at the northeast Siberian Highlands. From there, Siberian geography is time-dependent, meaning that during the ice ages, the fauna and flora of the northeast Siberian Highlands continue all the way to Alaska through what scientists call Beringia. During interglacials, when the ice recedes and the oceans rise, Beringia becomes increasingly waterlogged and eventually submerged, so that the eastern frontier of Siberia is much the same as it is today. That is, a coastline with the fauna and flora associated with the far northern hemisphere. On the south, a chain of mountains borders Siberia, and in the southwest, Siberia borders on the hills of Kazakhstan. During the North American Illinoisan glaciation, which is the fourth of the major 5 glaciations, an ice sheet some 2 miles thick covered the northern hemisphere rather continuously. And in Siberia, it was gone by 100,000 years ago, and is what is called the Sangamon interglacial in North America. Now that Sangamon period lasted until about 70,000 years ago, when the ice sheets began to reform. Now these are called the Wisconsin in North America, and they last through their maximum extent in southern protrusion, which is in Wisconsin, and in thickness about some 22,000 years ago. After this, Wisconsin glaciation began to melt, and it ended some 11,500 years ago. Now the sea levels again began to rise whenever the ice on the land melts, and the connection of Siberia to Alaska, that we call Beringia, was resubmerged. I've got a map I'm going to show you in a few minutes so you can kind of get a picture of this. But the snowfall across Northeast Asia and Alaska, Beringia, during the interglacial periods and during the glacial periods is almost non-existent. So those areas never get fully glaciated, and they were occupied by primitive communist hunters and gatherers throughout that period of time. And we're going to take a closer look at some specific sites, archaeological sites, in just a few minutes. Now, I should mention also that Mongolian geography is important here because it borders on Siberia. At 604,000 square miles, Mongolia is the most sparsely populated country in the world, with a population of only 3 million people. It is also the world's second largest landlocked country behind Kazakhstan, which is only 25 miles from Mongolia's western border. Mongolia contains very little arable land, as much of its area is covered by grassy steppe, with mountains to the north and west, and the Gobi Desert to the south. Its capital is called Red Flag, or Ulaanbaatar, and it's the largest city, and home to about half of the country's population. The climate of Central Asia became dry after the large tectonic collision between the Indian Plate, moving northward, and the Eurasian Plate. This impact threw up the massive chain of mountains known as the Himalayas. The Himalayas, Greater Khingan and Lesser Khingan mountains, act like a high wall, blocking the warm and wet climate from penetrating into Central Asia from the south, and the Urals block it from entering from the west. Many of the mountains of Mongolia were formed during the late Neogene and early Quaternary periods. The Quaternary is the last 4 million years or 5 million years, depending on which specialist you're looking at. The Mongolian climate was more humid hundreds of thousands of years ago, and Mongolia is known to be the source of priceless paleontological discoveries. The first scientifically confirmed dinosaur eggs were found in Mongolia during the 1923 expedition of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, led by Roy Chapman Andrews. Now, taking a closer look at Beringia, and then we'll take a look at it on the map. It's the land in a maritime area bounded on the west by the Lena River in Russia, and on the east by the Mackenzie River in Canada. Beringia extended north to 72 degrees north latitude and bordered on the Chukchi Sea. Beringia on the south extended to what is today the tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Beringia included the Chukchi Sea, the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait, the Chukchi and Kamchatka Peninsulas in Russia, as well as Alaska in the United States. During the Ice Ages, Beringia, like most of Siberia and all of North and Northeast China, was not glaciated because snowfall was very light. It was a grassland steppe stretching for hundreds of miles in Siberia and Alaska. The entire area subsumes land partially lying on the North American plate and land on the Siberian plate east of the Chersky Range. During glaciations, of which there have been 5 in the last 4 million years, 5 major ones, this area formed the Bering land bridge. It was 620 miles wide at its maximum width, covered an area of 620,000 square miles, and another way of thinking about it is that it was as large as British Columbia and Alberta together. Today, the only land still visible is from the central part of the Bering land bridge. These mountainous protrusions are called the Diomede Islands, one of which is U.S., one of which is Russian. The Pribilof Islands of St. Paul and St. George, St. Lawrence Island, and Kings Island. Band organized primitive communist human populations have moved across the entire Beringia area from terminal Illinoisan times until the historical era. We know this because Homo sapiens populations had reached Brazil by 70,000 years ago. Research conducted by my own Ice Mountain Archaeological expedition uncovered evidence for one early migration, and my doctoral dissertation presented proof of another later migration that had originated in northern China, Mongolia, Siberia, and northern Japan. Descendants of these latter people arrived in northern British Columbia by 9,500 years ago. Now just for a few comments about Alaskan geography before we take a look at the map. Alaska witnessed all 5 major Pleistocene glaciations and a multitude of minor ones. During Pleistocene glaciations, Alaska had a uniformly cool climate and corresponding environments. During the interglacials, Alaskan climate varied from Arctic and subarctic, alpine and subalpine to subtropical. Interglacials featured the local sea levels dropping until a land bridge connected the Americas to Siberia. And every time there's a massive buildup of ice on in the northern hemisphere, sea levels drop worldwide about 250 feet. Interglacials featured the land sea levels dropping until a land bridge connected the Americas to Siberia. Early humans and the animals they hunted crossed this bridge. Archaeologists have excavated their remains and those of then contemporary local wildlife, including butchered woolly mammoths. Some of these local fossils had attracted the attention of formerly trained scientists by the 1830s. Major local finds include the Kikak, Tegosik, the Pachyrhinosaurus bone bed, the Pleistocene-aged woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius is the Alaska state fossil. Now in 2017, interesting fact is that Chinese scientists announced that they had recovered and reconstructed the entire genome of the woolly mammoth. Their research awaits permission to go to the next stage, which is insertion of that DNA into the egg of an East Asian elephant. Paleolithic people moved into northwestern North America by 100,000 years ago, crossing the Bering land bridge as we have seen. Now, Initially, they found their passage eastward would have been blocked by a huge sheet of ice until a temporary recession in the Wisconsin glaciation, that is, the last ice age, opened up an ice-free corridor through Alberta. However, we know people made it further south so that they arrived in Brazil by 70,000 BP, and that's before present. And along their way, they left many archaeological remains in North, Middle, and South America. These primitive communists were organized as bands and eventually tribes of hunter-gatherers. They fanned out south of the intercontinental glaciation that covered Canada and much of what is now the lower 48 United States, and spread throughout the rest of the continent. Eventually, Alaska became populated by the Inuit and a variety of Native American groups. Now we come to the Yukon, which is in the northwestern part of Canada and is bordered by Alaska and the Northwest Territories and the Arctic Sea on the north, British Columbia on the south. The Yukon covers 475,000 square miles and about 475,000 square kilometers is land and 8,052 square kilometers is water. The sparsely populated territory abounds with snowmelt lakes and perennial white-capped mountains, including many of Canada's highest mountains. It is bounded on the south by the 60th parallel of latitude. Its northern coast is on the Beaufort Sea. Its western boundary is 141 degrees west longitude. Its ragged eastern boundary mostly follows the divide between the Yukon River Basin and the Mackenzie River watershed to the east in the Mackenzie Mountains. Except for the coastal plain on the Beaufort Sea, that is the Arctic Ocean coast, most of Yukon is part of the American Cordillera. The terrain includes mountain ranges, plateaus, and river valleys. And finally, in terms of geography, we come to northern British Columbia. This is a vast wilderness. Northern BC has 193,000 square miles of area and a diverse ecological geography. The Queen Charlotte Islands extend into northern BC latitudes and have an equally diverse ecology. Ancient old-growth forests phase into coastal rocky scarps coated with cedar and spruce. During World War II, at its outbreak, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers rushed that highway through to Alaska, preparing for a Japanese invasion. The equipment for its construction came from the lower 48 U.S. states on the eastern end at Dawson Creek. Other equipment came from the lower 48, was barged up the Stikine River to Dease Lake. There, the 50% of that equipment that had not been lost by being sunk was unloaded and used to build an access road to Watson Lake. And there, the equipment was used to start the Alaska Highway construction north and south from Watson Lake. So they were able to complete that highway within a year. British Columbia is made up of two major continental landforms, the interior plains in the province's northeast, the British Columbia portion of which is part of Alberta Plateau. The rest of the province is part of the Western Cordillera of North America, often referred to in Canada as the Pacific Cordillera or Canadian Cordillera. The Cordillera is divided into four main systems. That's as much of the geography as I'm going to comment on as we get started before we get into the primitive communism specifically of each of these areas. And then I'm going to turn to the map that's over here on my right and point out some of these areas that I think are important for you to take a look at. And as we get ready to do that, I'm going to mention that one of the sites you're going to see on the map over there is a village called Bakhtia, which is right on the Yenisei River, right square in the middle of Siberia. All right, now take a look first of all. In Northeast Asia, the western boundary is over here in the Ural Mountains. These mountains block all of the moisture coming from Europe. And the eastern boundary is over here in the, on the Yukon border in the Mackenzie Mountains. And that blocks most of the moisture coming from that direction as far as Yukon and Alaska are in northern BC are concerned. Now, this red pin right here is pointed straight at this village called Bakhtia. And right now on Netflix there's a movie streaming called The Happy People, and it has a subtitle, I forgot what that is right offhand, but the important thing is these people have not changed very much from primitive communist days. Yes, they have some modern equipment like snowmobiles and that sort of thing, but remember that Russia was under a Bolshevik government until relatively recently. So their primitive communism was purposely not replaced, and they were kind of encouraged to keep it on as they go. Only there's no way to get to this village of Bakhtia except by helicopter or bush pilot planes. Or 2 months of the year you can negotiate the Yenisei River and get up there. So these people are essentially uncontacted by either the capitalist or socialist world. Of course the Bolsheviks sent agents in there to propagandize them and make converts and bring some people back for further education in the major cities and then send them back in as their cadre. But with the exception of this kind of contact, their way of life is in many ways instructive. So if you get a chance as to what primitive communist way of life is like, you get a chance to take a look at that movie on Netflix. You want to do it, The Happy People. Anyhow, these happy people are pretty well representative of thousands of communities that existed in Siberia in primitive communist times, and that is before the advent of capitalism and the imperial Russian state. And that included, that was not just this area, but this entire area right here between these two continents was land 600 plus miles wide and covered the entire thing. And this same area we call Northeast Asia for primitive communist period purposes extends down to Mongolia, and this particular red pin is supposed to show the flaming cliffs of Mongolia. So if you get a chance to go on Google and take a look, type in flaming cliffs of Mongolia, you're going to see where Roy Chapman's Andrews first expedition in 1923 uncovered dinosaur eggs, and more importantly for our purposes, where his archaeologist Nels Nelson uncovered a massive number of microblade cores and microblades, which he later found in Fairbanks on the campus of the University of Alaska, where the same exact things had been excavated. And what that did was lead me to Ice Mountain, British Columbia on the Stikine River. But at any rate, now, on Beringia proper, there are only a couple of places that are still above water, and one of them is called Anangula Island, and you can see how far into the Aleutians it is right here where this red pin is. Then another critically important site, it was up here at Onion Portage, Alaska, where that particular one is. And then in the Tanata River Valley, there are half a dozen different sites that run between the Yukon border and the capital at Fairbanks. And then on the Stikine River, the furthest south we go with this group of people is to a place that we called Telegraph Creek on the map, and Mount Edziza, which is Canada's only active volcano, that the Indians up there, Tahltan Indians, call Ice Mountain, which is why I called my expedition the Ice Mountain Archaeological Expedition. So, primitive communist times extend from at least 100,000 years ago up here, all the way across to northern British Columbia. And there are at least two representations of this whole period of time, and that is the first one, which it looks to me now came across the land bridge sometime around 100,000 years ago, and they would have to have come that early in order to get to Brazil by 70,000 years ago. And on the Stikine River, the Tahltan River, at their confluence, my excavators and I found a terrace that had an ancient fireplace in it, and a long blade tool and a few other stone tools, completely unlike anything else that we were to find in that general area. And that probably is the first representation of that late Illinoisan, early Sangamon crossing. Now, going back to the microblade story real quickly so that we can go back to the text of this lecture. Nelson found all of these microblade cores here along the flaming cliffs of Mongolia, and then took them all back to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, after which they just sat there for many decades, except for a bunch that had been sent to the Field Museum in Chicago that sat there for many decades, and nobody even knew they had them at the Field Museum. When I walked in there one day and looked at the display they had, and I called up their archaeology department, told them who I was, and asked if they might have anything more, and they said, I don't think we do, but you're welcome to come up here and we'll take you to the storage room, which they did. And when we got there, we found drawers full of these microblade cores that Nelson had sent over there, and that nobody had ever done anything with, and until I was about to do it, photograph them and draw them and that sort of thing. But so that shows you what can happen. But that was an important clue. We had already excavated by this time the microblade cores in northern British Columbia on this Tahltan River, which I wrote my doctoral dissertation about, which is on file at the university, of course, in the department. And you can see illustrations of it in my textbook, Foundations of Archaeology, those tools and photographs, and you can see more information about all of that. So that was the second migration of primitive communists into the New World from Asia. Now, I'm going to get off of this map. We mentioned the Happy People movie on Netflix, Happy People, A Year on Taiga, it's called, about the village of Bakhtia in central Siberia on the Yenisei River, where many of the diagnostics of primitive communism have been carried over into the pre-modern communism form, and for all these reasons they'll be helpful in understanding this chapter. Primitive communism in the form of lower Paleolithic archaeological sites litter the Siberian landscape between East Kazakhstan to the Altai Republic, and a Neanderthal child burial was found at Teshiktash, Uzbekistan in 1938, along with tools that show similarities with the Mousterian artifactual assemblages of Iraq and Iran. Primitive communism continues in the Upper Paleolithic archaeological remains in the Ural Mountains. Petroglyphs depicting mammoths are found on the Altai River and on the Upper Yenisei River west of Lake Baikal, and pictographs are found dating to 25,000 BP on the shores of the Laptev Sea north of the Arctic Circle. Similarly dated remains of huts have been found in the settlement of Malta near Irkutsk. Sculptures of animals and Venus figurines of women date to the Siberian Upper Paleolithic. In the post-glacial period, taiga, T-A-I-G-A, or swampy coniferous forest occurs in the high northern latitudes, especially between the tundra and the steppes of Siberia and North America. Microblades and micro-tools appear in the Upper Paleolithic and continue through the Siberian Mesolithic. In Siberia, from 7,500 to 5,400 BP, archaeological sites feature the introduction of pottery. In southwest Siberia, by 5,000 BP, we see the introduction of copper working. However, so far in the northern and eastern regions of Siberia, copper work has not been detected. Certainly not that early. Now, primitive communism in Mongolia. We date Homo sapiens in Mongolia to about 800,000 years ago. We know this because stone tools have been found on the southern Gobi dating back as much as 800,000 years. And globally, we know that all humans had advanced from their erectus stage to their sapient stage by 1 million years ago. Another way of putting it is that all humans had cubic centimeter cranial capacities of approximately 1500 cc by that time. And if you want to remember, take a closer look, go back to lecture number 1 in this series, or the appropriate chapter in your volume 1, and to see how we today talk about, we use a genetic definition for species based upon their ability to use culture, where all of the other phenotypic aspects of the skulls and bones are irrelevant. Now, these people were hunters and gatherers from the time of their arrival, and that hunting-gathering lower Paleolithic mode of production lasted until the Middle Paleolithic, when broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation was extant. In June of 2016, a team of Polish and Mongolian researchers found stone tools in the southern Gobi Desert that they describe as highly diversified forms of objects found, and the various techniques of working stone prove that certain locations were repeatedly colonized. And Professor Siskulski of Wrocław University says the oldest tools there date to the Middle Paleolithic, between 200,000 and 40,000 years ago. The lakeshore site components were deposited when wildlife was abundant. The team also uncovered 11 Jasper artifacts, which were dated to about 40,000 years ago, and in the Upper Paleolithic that mode of production continued and was perfected. The Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic in Mongolia features microblade hunting and gathering, broad-spectrum wild resource exploiters. They occupied all of Mongolia, and they were concentrating on lake and dwelling and plant and animal species. Their remains constitute part of the Northeast Asian, Northwest American microblade tradition, NAMT or Nanat, which I named, which covers all of both these areas in the Upper Paleolithic, Lithic in the New World, Old and New Worlds respectively. Now, following this, in Mongolia, we have the transition from primitive communism and the rise of the pastoral chiefdoms. In Mongolia and in Siberia, we find ancient megaliths, which are called deerstones or reindeer stone megaliths over there. They're carved with symbols that can be found all over Central and Eastern Eurasia, but are concentrated largely in Siberia and Mongolia. Most deerstone megaliths occur in association with ancient graves. Extrapolating from similar megalith building cultures in Europe and the Americas, we can hypothesize that deerstones megaliths were supposed to be guardians of the dead. There are around 600 deerstones known in Mongolia, and so far there are a total of 900 deerstones megaliths known in Central Asia and South Siberia. Deerstone megaliths would have to have been rooted in the animism and animatism as practiced by part-time specialists we call shamans. Most archaeologists I'm familiar with date the cultures from 4000 to 5000 BP. They appear to mark the graves of important hunting and gathering chiefs of simple chiefdoms. So we have the emergence of the simple chiefdom stage here. Later inhabitants of the area reused them to mark their own burial mounds, as these societies took on the characteristics of advanced theocratic chiefdoms of the pastoral as opposed to agricultural variety. In Mongolia, there are 550 such megaliths. In the Lake Baikal area and the Sayan Altai and Altai mountain regions, there are 20, 20, and 60 known deerstone megaliths, respectively, and moreover, there are another 20 megaliths of this type in Kazakhstan in the Middle East, and 10 further west, specifically in the Ukraine and parts of the Russian Federation, including the provinces of Orenburg and the Caucasus, and near the Elbe River. Now, when we move to the Beringia area, the only parts above water at this time are the Diomede Island site and the Anangula site, which we just took a look at a minute ago on our map. Little Diomede Island is located about 25 miles west from the mainland in the middle of the Bering Strait. It's only about a half a mile wide from the international date line and about 2.5 miles from the Russian island of Big Diomede. When Alaska was still connected to Siberia over 10,000 years ago by the Bering Land Bridge, Little Diomede was not an island but was part of Beringia and accessible by foot. However, it is unknown if humans visited the grounds of the Little Diomede at that time. Most likely the first visitors to the island came simply by foot on top of the sea ice, and later umiaks were used for visiting the neighboring Big Diomede Island, whale hunting, fishing, and later to access mainlands in Asia and Siberia. Boats made out of driftwood and whaleskin are still used today. Back in the days of the old Cold War, these islanders drove the secret police on both sides of the Cold War crazy, because they just go back and forth at any time they feel like it, without paying any attention to the international boundaries. But that's another story. At any rate, Anangula is the oldest archaeological site in the Aleutian Islands. The Anangula Archaeological District National Historic Landmark is on the tiny 1.5 mile wide or mile long Ananuliak Island, or Anangula Island, of the Aleutian Island chain. The Anangula Archaeological District is made up of two pre-contact sites, the Anangula Village site and the Anangula Core and Blade manufacturing site. The Core and Blade site sits atop a bluff that provides a view of fish, sea mammals, and boats that might be passing by. A ridgeline protects the site from strong Aleutian winds. The village site was built on an even higher sea cliff than the core and blade site and has views of Nikolski Bay and Umnak Island. Climbing ridgelines surround the village on the north and west, protecting it from the wind. The Aleutian chain faces the Bering Sea to the north and the Pacific Ocean to the south. The archipelago follows the arc of the Aleutian Trench, where the Pacific Plate meets the North American Plate. The Aleutian Islands encompass 52 volcanoes, 27 of which are active. Anegula Island is within the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Migratory seabirds nest in the rocky cliffs now on the island, while rabbits roam the grassy slopes of the island. The rabbits were introduced as prey for commercial fox breeding in the 1930s, but the foxes were eventually removed when the area became a wildlife refuge. Now, there's an ancient tool factory at Igash Shilu, which means the place for making stone blades in the native language, and is around 9,000 years old. It represents one of the earliest known human occupations in the Aleutian chain, and the earliest known ancestors of the Onondaga or Alaskan Aleut. And of course, earliest known doesn't really mean much, because the earliest would have been much earlier than that, but is now submerged. The core and blade site covers an extensive horizontal area. The most common stone tool making technique at the site produces long, narrow blades, which yield polyhedral shaped cores. Many of the blades are retouched with finer flaking perpendicular to the edges to create a sharper blade. And in some ways, these are similar to the microblade core and microblade technology found in Northeast Asia and at Telegraph Creek, British Columbia, but without the distinct Kobayashi system A. This is an important relationship that needs to be worked out. Other stone tools include scrapers and abraders. These stone tools are fashioned from chert, shale, basalt andesite, and obsidian, none of which are available in the immediate area. Another curious feature of this specialized manufacture site is the absence of hammerstones. So the absence of striking tools at this manufacturing site leads to the possibilities that first, the same material of the blades was used for striking tools. Second, organic material used as hammers have decomposed. And finally, the artists carried their tool-making tools away with them when they left the factory. The core and blade factory was eventually covered by multiple layers of volcanic ash, which are easily dated, and in some places up to 6 feet thick. The original Aleutian village sites, the large ancestral Anegula village site, is younger than the core and blade site. The Anegula village site was built on a bluff over 70 feet above the sea, and here are remains of dozens of semi-subterranean houses, storage pits, tool scatters, and a few densely packed midden features. Another smaller village site of the same age is on the opposite side of the island from the main village, and the smaller village was a seasonal camp used by people from the main village. At the main village site, archaeologists have recorded up to 24 depressions in the ground that indicate the location of house ruins, and many more smaller depressions revealing the location of storage pits. The houses are arranged in 3 kinship unit reflecting rows along the edge of the bluff, and this is the same pattern as recorded at the Tahltan River ethnographic village site number 2 of the Ice Mountain Archaeological Expedition. A small stream supplying fresh water runs down the cliff face to a narrow beach below. Only 6 of these houses have been excavated. Each of these is semi-subterranean and roughly rectangular ovoid in shape, and they range from 13 to 20 feet across and 20 to 30 feet wide. Archaeologists there have also excavated some of the contents of a midden feature. On a slope at the edge of the village are additional archaeological remains. These have stone paved floors and narrow trenches on 2 sides that meet to form a V shape, with the point of the V on the uphill side of the ruin. The V-shaped trenches drained moisture from the floors, and these structures were used as food storage facilities, especially for a root plant called umquan. This is proof of the broad-spectrum revolution. Anegula village was buried beneath deep layers of volcanic ash that have grown over with ryegrass and monkshood. The ash layers protected the site from wind erosion. Archaeologists found hammerstones, anvil blades, scrapers, retouched blades, and tools made for right-handed or left-handed use. These artifacts were preserved in their original position at the time of the ashfall. Outside the houses are several intact stone tool workshops, where thousands of stone flakes had been left behind by these ancient craftspeople. 20,000 artifacts were recovered from less than 1% of the site area. Nearby on Umnak Island is Nikolski Village, where the residents trace their ancestry back to the Anangula village site. The Aleutian Eskimos have transferred cultural practices, technology, and artistic style from generation to generation for thousands of years. This makes Aleutian culture an extraordinary segment of Aboriginal cultures in the Americas. They geared their technology toward a maritime environment, traveling across the sea and creating shelter in a treeless environment prone to powerful sea storms and windstorms. Archaeologists estimate around 200 people at a time lived at this village over a period of about 500 years, practicing a maritime economy. Their stone tools bear little resemblance to contemporaneous sites in interior Alaska. Instead, they resemble tools found in Hokkaido, Japan, and eastern Siberia. The technology seen at Higashi-Shilu core and braid site continues the Upper Paleolithic tool technology of Siberia. DNA studies of contemporary and pre-contact Aleutian Islanders demonstrate an overall cultural continuity with notable incursions and excursions of people and cultural elements into and out of the eastern Aleutians. During occupation of the core and blade site, Ananulak Island was a peninsula of Umnak Island, forming the northern cape of Nikolski Bay. Geological studies reveal that early Holocene deglaciation in the region occurred about 10,000 years ago, and the regional climate was warmer and drier. Prior to 8,000 years ago, sea levels were similar to today's, and the area was the first deep, ice-free pass between the Bering Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Ancient settlers reached this area by boat, bringing their maritime culture and technology with them. The Okmok eruption ended the earliest occupation of Anangula Island when over 6 feet of ash accumulated there. After 8,000 BP, the sea level rose and peaked at about 6.5 feet higher than today's levels and began to lower again around 3,000 years ago. The sea level rose after 8,000 BP, wiping out many of the archaeological remains of these earliest settlements of Beringia. Unique preservation conditions make Anangula Archaeological District National Historic Landmark an especially valuable resource. And now we get on the road to Onion Portage, Alaska. Beginning in 1941, archaeologists found a series of deeply stratified sites here in the Kobuk River drainage. It's K-O-B-U-K. There are no highways into the far northwestern region of Alaska's Arctic, and even air travel is restricted to very small planes. There are few visitors to the little Eskimo villages along the Kobuk River. The Kobuk is a sizable river that winds its way along a 200-mile route from its headwaters in the Brooks Range to Kotzebue Sound and the Chukchi Sea. The river keeps well above the Arctic Circle en route. It rolls through a landscape of birch, spruce, poplar, and willow, and then courses through rolling tundra as it nears its ocean destination. The Kobuk River is busy with local boat and barge traffic in the short ice-free summer months, and with snow machines in the winter. They mean snowmobiles. There are no contemporary hiking trails or campgrounds along the river's route, but there are small Eskimo villages, Kobuk, Shugnak, Ambler, and finally Kiena, the closest to the estuary of the river. This remote Kobuk Valley has been home to people for many millennia. The oldest house pits were excavated about midway on the Kobuk at the site of the natural portage. They reveal that ancient man had camped here for generation after generation. Great herds of caribou thundered across the river at this crossing during their annual southbound migrations thousands of years ago, as the animals still do today. Those early hunters left behind evidence of their culture. In Alaska, that earliest human was a predecessor to the Eskimo. Eskimos are by definition people of the sea, subsisting on seals, whales, and other creatures of the icy oceans. But some of these early and some present Kobuk River inhabitants of Alaska require a different definition. They migrated inland, perhaps seasonally, to take advantage not only of the bounty of the ocean, but of the woodlands that provided caribou and other game. So beginning in the late 1930s, the University of Alaska in Fairbanks sent its own and visiting anthropologists to explore and document findings in the unexplored vastness of the Kobuk River, which at that time was not even mapped because of its unexplored remoteness and its unique woodland population. And they were there intrigued by stories of a legendary mountain of jade. They heard tales from gold rush miners in the wilds of Alaska of having unearthed tusks of woolly mammoths, even those of mastodons. There had been skepticism, but the tales turned out to be true, as was the mountain of jade. Jade Mountain was an entire mountain made of beautiful dark green jade that is far from any Alaska road system. It is one of the westernmost peaks of the Brooks Range, aptly named Jade Mountain, and it is about 150 miles east of Kotzebue, the closest large town. The university scientists documented it. They also recorded a number of legends about the amazing mountain. Today, the presence of Alaska's dark green jade, the gem the Chinese call the Stone of Heaven, is well known. At the signing of Alaska's Constitution by delegates in 1956, the ceremony was lit by a jade lamp adorned with gold and silver trim. I remember that ceremony pretty well because at that time the Attorney General of Alaska was at my father's home, our home in Boise, Idaho, and his name was Jerry Williams. He'd said that if Alaska ever becomes a state, he would push a peanut by his nose all the way to Fairbanks from the ocean, and he settled for pushing it down the sidewalk of our house there in Boise so the press could get a picture of it. At any rate, today the presence of Alaska's dark green jade, I just mentioned that, the delegate Marvin Muktuk Marston provided it for the occasion. That is the jade, the organizer of the World War II Eskimo Scouts, who served during the frightening years of the Alaska theater of World War II. And in 1968, the Alaska legislature named jade as its official state gem. Specimens are on display all over the state. In Fairbanks, the Nana Native Corporation donated a 3,600-pound block of jade from the Kobuk River mountain. In 1950, a large block of that jade was ordered by Argentina to be used as a memorial to Evita Peron. By the time the block got to Fairbanks, Argentina had canceled the order. Alaska's thousands of summer tourists leave homeward bound with jewelry and trinkets made of Alaska jade from that remote valley. Now, ancient humans picked up nuggets of jade that tumbled downstream in the spring into the Kobuk River, and they used the jade for tools and weapons, and some of these artifacts were left behind in house pits, eventually to be found by archaeologists, and we excavated one jade or jadeite Ice Mountain. At any rate, anthropologists in the 1940s through the 1960s trekked across the Kobuk tundra and the woodlands farther inland and canoed down the Kobuk River, and along the way they stopped to dig at a site downriver from Jade Mountain that's called Onion Portage. Now, Onion Portage is a place where wild onions grew in profusion and caribou herds crossed the river during their annual migrations. Accordingly, archaeologists saw it as a logical place to look for evidence of human habitation. Visiting anthropologist Louis Giddings from Brown University made a surface investigation of the house pits at Onion Portage before World War II. Then, in the 1960s, he began to work that site in earnest. By 1963, a large crew of scientists and helpers were working that site, and they were carefully uncovering layer after layer of habitation and collecting the artifacts of each layer's exposure. Onion Portage was, and may still be, the oldest human campsite so far known in Alaska. In one of Giddings' several books, he also tells of finds at Cape Krusenstern that is now a national monument on the Arctic Ocean just north of Kotzebue. This site of ancient populations is quite large, indicating a large population, proving again that peoples of the Upper Paleolithic in Siberia, or the Upper Lithic in North America, were very competent, broad-spectrum, wild resource exploiters. They would have had a lot of time on their hands, which, like all cultures of this mode of production, would have been spent in thinking and talking about their environment in supernatural as well as natural terms. Acting on these beliefs included proof found in one Krusenstern site where the ancient skeletons had ivory spinal columns holding the vertebrae together, and with eye sockets filled with ivory eyeballs. Professor Giddings died in a car wreck just a year after his remarkable dig at Onion Portage, and his books leave readers waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then we come to the Tanata River Valley of interior Alaska, which I pointed out on the map, and is down in what is today the southeastern portion of Alaska, where it runs from the Yukon border straight up to Fairbanks. So it was occupied, this Tanata River Valley, by at least 3 different times. The last occupation was only 2,500 years ago. The oldest excavation of that site occurred, or the oldest occupation of that site occurred between 11 and 12,000 years ago, according to radiocarbon dating, and that site would have been occupied the same time as the Tanata complex sites in Alaska. Features found at the site include hearths with charcoal dating at approximately 12,200 BP, implying that some form of temporary occupation occurred, which could include using the site as a temporary base. A small bone needle found at one of these hearths supports this theory, and the evidence is of small band population camps that served as bases for seasonal hunting groups, the manufacture of tools and maintenance, as well as food processing and skin working, are shown by the remains of the bone needle, and they were routine there. The Beringian period is the oldest in the Tanata River Valley. This is the period between 13,000 BP, when the land bridge connecting Alaska and Siberia remained. The Beringian period is subdivided into the older part, dating prior to 13,500 BP, and the more recent part, called the Chiefdom complex, falling between 13,500 and 13,000 BP. Stone tools dated before 13,500 BP include bifacial tools, blade and microblade technology, and only 3 sites in the Tanata River Valley have reliably been dated to this period. They're called Swan Point, the Mead site, and Broken Mammoth. Now, the Broken Mammoth site can be considered as part of the Tanata complex of tool manufacturing and techniques, and the Chiefdom complex dates from 13,500 to 13,000 years ago. The stone tools from this period are small, triangular or teardrop-shaped bifaces, usually made of thin flakes and often poorly edge-flaked. The Chiefdom complex is inadequately known at the Broken Mammoth site, where only a few flakes and bones are directly dated to within this period, and no microblades yet have been found there. Artifacts found at the Broken Mammoth site in Cultural Zone 1 include retouched flakes, end and side scrapers, points and point fragments, flake burins, burin spalls, microblades, and microblade cores. The materials that these artifacts were made from include rhyolite, chalcedony, chert, basalt, and obsidian, the latter providing even more evidence toward an earlier peopling of North America. The obsidian that comprised some of the artifacts originated from Matsatana in northwest Alaska and from the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve area in East Alaska. This implies that older sites must exist because the raw materials must have been obtained and then distributed to other regions through trade and interaction. Until these sites are discovered, we will not know when the occupation of the Beringian Straits began. Until then, Broken Mammoth establishes the earliest date between 11,000 and 12,000 BP. Other zone artifacts from Culture Zone 1 include a complete lanceolate point. Culture Zone 2 produced a few flakes, fire-broken rocks, and hearthstones, and the possibility that microblades could be excavated closer to the bluff edge. Excavations in Cultural Zone 3 at the site have yielded many tiny flakes, retouched flakes, larger biface fragments, points and point fragments, hammers made of quartz, and anvils. A small-eyed bone needle was found associated with the hearth that radiocarbon dates to 10,300 BP. The bone needle suggests that the occupants used this site to process skins to make clothing. Debris from the making of tools has been found in Cultural Zone 4. The debris is composed of rhyolite, basalt, obsidian, chert, and quartzite, implying that the occupants of the site carried out some manufacturing and/or repair of tools. Artifacts at this zone include retouched flakes, scrapers, and a large quartz chopper scraper plane. Also several ivory tusk fragments with scratches that came from stone tools. One tusk fragment had a stone microchip embedded in one of its scratches. A stone tool cache was also found with ivory artifacts, 2 projectile points and a possible handle, and one of the ivory fragments from this cache was radiocarbon dated to about 16,000 BP. The age of the ivory suggests that the documents brought it from a much older kill site. The obsidian used at this site came from Wiki Peak and is dated as early as 13,400 BP. The same obsidian was also used at the Walker Road site and Moose Creek site in the same area that date earlier than 13,000 BP. The discovery of the Broken Mammoth site establishes that human occupation of central Alaska began sometime before 11,000 BP. Artifactual evidence proves humans occupied parts of central Alaska before 13,500 BP, and people had to have lived in the region even earlier given the probable early Sangamon interglacial site at the confluence of the Staltan and Stikine rivers in northern BC. The obsidian artifacts discovered at Broken Mammoth prove earlier occupation in northwest and east Alaska. The Broken Mammoth site offers excellent preservation of remains of the animals, providing insight into the hunting methods and food resources utilized by these early peoples in North America. Early occupation of the Broken Mammoth had a setting similar to the lowland tundra with low vegetation, mostly shrubs, and few trees. The regional pollen record provides evidence of shrubland with plant life including dwarf birch and willow. And about 9,000 years ago, this shrubland became woodland, which supported spruce, and alder trees. And the fossil remains of a red squirrel and porcupine date the process of forestation at slightly more than 9,500 years ago there. Windier conditions reestablished in Broken Mammoth around 10,000 BP, with loess accumulation accelerating until about 7,800 BP, when modern climate stabilized after 5,700 BP. The stratigraphy at Broken Mammoth is well preserved and is one of the primary factors that have established the age of the site. The site consists of wind-deposited sand and loess overlying weathered bedrock at the Yukon Tanata crystalline terrace. These deposits are divided in 4 units, A, B, C, and D, the oldest layer being Unit A, and is composed of fine sand dating to approximately 12,000 BP. Units B, C, and D are also made up of wind-blown aeolian silt or loess. Unit B contains 3 different paleosol, that is, ancient soil complexes, with B1 dating from 11,200 to 11,800. Unit B2 dates from 10,300 to 9,300. There is no direct dating for B3, and Unit C dates to sometime after 9,000 BP. The final Unit D is an accumulation of silt deposits over the last 9 to 8,000 years. Large mammals, fish and waterfowl provide a broad spectrum of plentiful, exploitable wild resources, especially one remembers that avian fauna was extremely diverse, including mallard, teal, swan, and geese. The Broken Mammoth site has remains of large animals, including mammoth, elk, caribou, and bison. Furthermore, hunted or scavenged people had access to mammoth ivory. Radiocarbon dates on some of the fossilized ivory tools run from 20,000 to 18,000 BP, and their hearth charcoal dates to 13,500 BP. Anyway, these people were organized into highly mobile bands that moved seasonally over the landscapes, exploiting the various resources and wildlife. Interception of the various migratory routes of herds of bison and elk and migratory birds was the strategy that may have required a commoditization of their labor power occasionally. People had the technology for hunting mammoths, but they probably killed one mammoth in a lifetime and never stopped talking about it. As I say, the ivory tools made from mammoth tusks was probably scavenged. The Swan Point archaeological site is located in eastern central Alaska, again in the Tanana River watershed. It is one of a collection of sites in the area that have yielded the oldest evidence of human habitation. The Tanata sites provide the only evidence to date of megafauna that no longer exist in Alaska, including extinct varieties of wapiti, that is elk, bison, and mammoth. Artifacts at the Swan Point site have been given radiocarbon dates of 14,500 years BP, and Swan Point has been occupied at least 5 times since then. Charcoal has been radiocarbon dated to 14,500 BP, and the charcoal dating makes this the oldest known site in the Tanana River Valley, where there are 5 occupation zones, and I go through each one of those. I won't bother with doing that here, except to say that the oldest one is 11,600 to 10,000 BP, and that's followed by another one in the late Pleistocene that dates to about 10,230 BP, and then we have the middle to late Holocene zone, which has no direct dates but has lots of microblade cores and microblades and burins. Then they have the late Holocene sites that represent 1,700 years of the Holocene with artifacts of the same type, including stone fragment scrapers, straight-based lancelet points, and microblades. And finally, in the very top zone, we have the historic zone, which has tin cans, 30-30 rifle cartridges, an iron tang knife, and an early historic glass bottle, which reminds me that in our historic site at Ice Mountain, we found projectile points made of bottle glass. Fauna, flora, and climate. The remains of them are few and poorly preserved there, but they do include swan, goose, and moose dating from the middle to late Holocene zone. Now, the climate and environment at Swan Point is the same as that for Broken Mammoth, that is to say lowland tundra and low vegetation. Charcoal remains indicate wood from populus and willow and are associated with the oldest artifacts found at the site. Then I go through the stratigraphic details, which I'm not going to do here, but they will be of interest to some of you. And obsidian lithics made from material from the Wrangell Mountains have also been found at Swan Point in the lowest levels of the loess, typologically identical to the lithics found in Broken Mammoth. The obsidian microblades found in Broken Mammoth were made from the same obsidian material as the ones found at Swan Point, indicating a strong connection between these sites. Now there's the Dry Creek site, the Dry Creek archaeological site not far outside of the Denali National Park and Preserve. It's a multi-component site whose stratified remains have yielded evidence of human occupation as early as 11,000 years ago, located on the northern flanks of the Alaska Range near Healy, Alaska, in the Nenana River watershed. And there are 4 major components to that Dry Creek site. The most recent, dating between 2600 and 1400 BC. The youngest component is one of the few places in the Alaskan interior with notched projectile points. The 2 oldest components there at Dry Creek are dated from 11,000 to 10,500 BP and include assemblages of microblade stone technology. And multiple types of stone tools have been found there, which I list in your textbook when you get it. And finally, there's a place called On Your Knees Cave, which is an archaeological site located in southeast Alaska on the northern tip of Prince of Wales Island in the Tongass National Forest. Its location is approximately half a mile from the coast and 125 meters above sea level. Originally, large rocks and soil had fallen from the cliff above, obstructing the entrance of the cave. However, the entrance of the cave also was heavily covered with vegetation. These factors made the entrance of the cave very difficult to find when the Tongass Cave project began to work near the site, and after the obstructions were cleared, the entrance proved to be very small, thereby giving the cave its name. The manner one must enter in the cave being on your knees. Once inside the cave, there's a lengthy tunnel with an extremely low ceiling. Human skeletal remains there date between 10,730 and 10,300 BP. These are in association with stone tools and edible bones. Isotopic analysis prove a marine source-based diet. Old bear dens within the cave were explored and numerous animal bones found. The human skeletal remains included a mandible with all but the incisors, partial remains of a right pelvis, and small other fragments. And Onyernes Cave is currently one of the earliest known settlements along the northwest coast of North America, where DNA has been extracted from one of the individual's molars. The genetic analysis revealed that the individual was a male. Further examination of the teeth indicated that the man died in his mid-20s, which would be about the normal lifespan at that time. Through mitochondrial DNA, the individual was determined to be a member of the subgroup haplogroup B. I discussed that in the book, but we don't need to go through here anymore. And also some of the other possible associations. 100 animal bone samples from Onyernes Cave underwent carbon-14 dating, and they were older than 40,000 years. There was almost continuous occupation and use of the cave by animals, indicating the island was never completely glaciated or uninhabitable during this interval. The stone tools that were found within the cave were made at the site, but not of materials known to be from the site, such as obsidian. Since the cave site is on an island and some lithic material was not known to the site people at the time, they had to have been mariners who crossed the bodies of water by boat, and the evidence of marine-based diet, extra-local artifacts, and a maritime adaptation provide a coastal migration model across Beringia. Now, for primitive communism in the Yukon, we begin with the Proto-Athabascan peoples. By historic times, the Yukon was inhabited by nomadic Athabascan-speaking Native Americans with established extensive trading networks with the Pacific Coast Tlingit. These Athabascans are the linguistic descendants of Morris Swanish's Proto-Athabascan speakers, who themselves were descendants of his reconstructed language family called Nadene of Northeast Asia and Northwest America. The interior people traded copper, furs, and meat for coastal products such as Aleutian oil. 20% of contemporary Yukon population is of Aboriginal origin. There is no Inuit population in Yukon, although there was a population along the Arctic Ocean coast in historic times. Richard S. McNeish did the first systematic survey of the southwest Yukon, discovering many microblade-containing sites. All of these are, of course, of the primitive communist stages. Now, finally, we come to primitive communism in northern British Columbia, and what I call the early Sangamon occupation. I reported the existence of a middle terrace at Ice Mountain Site number 1 that I now believe dates to the early Sangamon Interglacial. My preliminary report of the 1969 Ice Mountain Archaeological Expedition refers to this site, as does an article I wrote with Valerie Harrison a few years later in the Journal of Field Archaeology. The stone tools found there in a buried fireplace context include a large blade tool of basalt, and all of the tools are typologically distinct from the Nanat microblade and core industries found in the other sites along the Toltan and Stikine River. Now, with the arrival of Kobayashi technology, we have the final cultural horizon I'm going to talk about with regard to primitive communism. Now, you recall that Roy Chapman Andrews brought along with him Nell C. Nelson of his expedition in 1923 to Mongolia as his archaeologist, and Nelson recovered thousands of microblades and microblade cores from which they had been struck. And I mentioned that these microblades were thin and only a centimeter in width and a few centimeters in length, and that I had found many of Nelson's microblades and cores decades later in the Field Museum in Chicago. Andrews had sent them to the Field Museum from the American Museum in New York City after his return to the USA, and they lay in that Field Museum repository and were forgotten in New York. Over the years, various investigators described those in New York as wedge-shaped, cylindrical, and pencil-shaped cores. In the early 1930s, Nelson saw a group of cores that had been recovered on the campus of the Alaska State University in Fairbanks. He called them campus cores and noted their similarity to what he had recovered in Mongolia a few years before. He further mentions that the way in which the blades had been struck from the cores was identical to what he had found in the Gobi Desert. By this time, his Mongolian cores were widely described as Gobi cores, And so finding the same thing in Fairbanks was a strong clue about migration into the New World. And it's what triggered, well anyway, in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, similar wedge-shaped microblade cores were found throughout the Yukon and the Northwest Territories of Canada. In 1969, my most important find was of the same Shirataki core scrapers and associated lithic remnants at Ice Mountain Site number 2 above the Tahltan River. In that site, we had an identical toolkit to what had been described a few years earlier by Kobayashi for Hokkaido, Japan. As for what I named the Ice Mountain microblade core and core industry, I have described it in detail in my doctoral dissertation at the University of Calgary and in the Journal of Field Archaeology issue number 1, and you will find illustrations of the Kobayashi technology and all 3 Kobayashi tool types in my textbook, Foundations of Archaeology. And with that, I'm bringing our discussion of primitive communism in Northeast Asia and North and West America to a conclusion. And in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of society in Siberia and Mongolia through the chiefdom stages to the period of imperial feudalism and very finally of imperial capitalism, with the imperial feudalism as a kind of context. So that takes care of it for today.